Everybody who's listening online. We actually have relatively few people here in the room. We're here to hear the next Treats talk provided by Professor Brightman, who's the Associate Professor of Engineering Practice at Purdue University and the Assistant Head of the Weldon School of Biomedical Engineering, also at Purdue. And Professor Brightman has been an active and important member of the Bioethics and Subject Advocacy Program of the Indiana CTSI for the last few years, providing a key role, bringing to us expertise both in education ethics and engineering ethics, as well as other topics in bioethics and research ethics. And so today, Professor Brightman will speak to us on the question, does it pay to partner with medical device companies considering conflict of interest, or COI? And again, these are the Treats talks, the Translational Research Ethics Applied Topics talks, which are meant to provide a short introduction to a central and important question in research ethics that would be helpful to people who are actually conducting or designing research. And Professor Brightman has designed this talk with that in mind. And so relatively, I've had the opportunity to see his slides. And it's going to be a relatively extensive and in-depth introduction to conflict of interest issues as they apply to engineering ethics and some other areas. And it'll really highlight some of the ethics issues here and should provide, in the hour or less that we have, a pretty good introduction to these topics for researchers and others who want to learn about these topics. So I shouldn't have said so much. Maybe I preempted his own introduction. But with that short introduction, I'll give you over to Professor Brightman.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and want to go immediately to a little bit of my background and interest in this area, which may help frame the conversation a little bit. My interest in conflicts of interest questions began when I was in pharmaceutical industry, was a postdoc at Eli Lilly, which is here in Indianapolis, and at that time, it was in the 90s, pharmaceuticals were under a lot of scrutiny for their partnerships, not necessarily Eli Lilly, I'm not impugning them, but it was in the media quite a bit, and so it caught my attention even though I was primarily a research bench scientist at the time. I came to Purdue University as a research scientist in the Biomedical Engineering Center, where I worked on developing some tissue engineering technology that eventually was licensed to a medical device company and became a startup. Two of my colleagues who were Purdue PhD biomedical engineers were hired to lead research and development aspects of that company, which is a very successful company with medical device products, clinical products in the marketplace. And so for about 5 years after that, I was consulting with industry around this technology, particularly, and other sort of bioengineering, biomedical engineering approaches to new medical device technology. When the School of Biomedical Engineering started, I became faculty there, and I've developed ethics and regulatory science courses and have some funded research in engineering ethics education. I'm primarily an engineering educator, engineering education researcher, but this is an area which I'm really interested in. In light of this being about conflict of interest, I want to make an initial disclosure that I have worked and continue to work with engineers and regulatory scientists, primarily from the Cook Group of medical device companies. They come and are expert lecturers in my engineering ethics course and regulatory science courses that we teach at Purdue. I've also published technical research articles with several employees from the Cook Group as co-authors. I do receive royalty payments annually from the technology licensing that comes to Purdue and to the inventors of the technology from the Cook Group and others who've licensed this technology. But I don't receive any consulting fees or other direct or indirect payments. So that's my disclosure in this particular realm. And so the question I think that some researchers, clinical researchers may ask is, why would I work with an industry partner? And I would suggest, as the literature has documented, that there are a number of very beneficial clinical outcomes that come from such research collaborations. There's new discoveries, therapeutic innovations, certainly some faster commercialization and successful translation into the clinic with a goal of better medical practice at lower costs. That's sort of the ideal advantages that the companies often bring the latest state of technology, insights on problems and questions that could have real relevance, or even opportunities for advancements in the research realm itself. However, there are and have been lots of complications fraught in these research collaborations and partnerships of industry and academic medicine, particularly that the problem with compromised scientific as well as professional obligations due to the influence of potential or actual financial, professional, personal gain. And I mention potential because there's certainly some level of stigma that's been attached to having any sort of collaborations with industry and the funding that can come from that. So people have to be aware of that. And there have been policies and regulations put in place on both sides of this, on the industry side, medical device industry side, as well as the academic medicine centers side, to help guard against it. And we want to talk about some of those guards. I want to just jump us into a quick case to think about this case recently. An 80-year-old man from Minnesota was prepared for a wrist operation when a test showed his abdominal aorta was at high risk of rupturing. So he was referred quickly to nearby Mayo Clinic, where he received an experimental medical device, the Tambi abdominal aortic stent, a product made by Gore and Associates. The FDA had found this experimental device, the stent, was promising, but had not yet approved it as safe and effective. So the stent maker provided the device for free, as well as paid all the medical expenses for this treatment. And the question is, was that a violation of conflict of interest rules and guidelines in this case? And I'm going to talk about a few things, rationale for support of this sort of approach, and some concerns with such an approach of having company financial support of research and clinical practice. So one of the arguments that's been made for industry involvement, medical device involvement in clinical research, is that without access to experimental devices, the clinicians often have to improvise with some sort of off-label, commercially available devices that tend to have a higher potential rate of failure or possible harm to the patients. In addition, the argument that cutting-edge new technologies, medical devices, get approved in Europe well before many of them are made available to patients in the U.S., so delaying possible positive outcomes for the patients. It's been argued in the literature, and certainly with many examples, that close collaboration is critical for testing feasibility and effectiveness of innovative and complicated devices, particularly in this device area where it's sometimes necessary to have the engineers or the people who design the device on hand and closely aligned to carry out the testing, early feasibility for these devices. Early experimental clinical studies can also promote better development of full-scale clinical trials necessary for approval and evidence-based practice. And finally, the funding streams have gotten more limited, so there's a difficulty for doing certain kinds of clinical research, particularly funding for comparative effectiveness studies. And so this is a place where industry partners can come in and provide some support. On the other hand, there's been quite a bit of criticism of company financial support. One of the main arguments is that there's the possibility that financial support would influence the clinical decision-making and subjugate the patient's best interest. Certainly, if the support of the company is not disclosed to the patient, then the autonomy of the patient would be compromised. How do they make clear medical decisions and choices if they do not fully understand where the resources are coming from to support such innovative experimentation? the argument is that, and has been borne out, that all stages of research, method selection, experimental design, data analysis, as well as results reporting, have significant potential for the negative outcomes of influence and bias. And that includes the fact that occasionally in the relationships that have been in place in research industry can squelch reporting of unfavorable findings toward their experimental devices. And perhaps the most influential is the many cases of inappropriate behaviors by both industry personnel and academic researchers that have led to disastrous failures of both scientific integrity and clinical translation, as well as harm to patients. So this is an area that has potential for harm and thus needs to be carefully regulated. And so both the industry and the academic health centers have come up with regulations and policies and procedures to follow, and ethics and compliance committees to oversee this. And I'd like to look at some of that. But the two key ethical issues that are at play here in deciding, do we participate in partnerships with industry, medical device industry, or not, is to pay attention to minimizing the risk of harm due to bias and influence that, as we've said, can reduce scientific objectivity and integrity in the research, as well as hinder the ability of patients and healthcare providers to make well-informed decisions. At the same time, encouraging the beneficial research partnerships between industry and clinical researchers that can generate innovation, it can accelerate translation and reduce cost. Thus, there is a push on both of these ethical issues to move them forward and to see the benefits for patient care. So in this particular case that I've talked about, this was an early feasibility study, which is a newly initiated, well, within the last couple of years, option for medical device companies to get innovative new devices into clinical testing in early stages. It was an approved early phase feasibility study approved by the FDA. It was allowed to have industry support in the provision of the device and the support of the funding for the treatment with appropriate transparency and disclosure policies and guidances in place. So these sorts of early phase trials are going to become more important in the years ahead. Now, medical device industry has been funding clinical care as well as translational research for a number of years, but in a much smaller amount than the pharmaceutical biotechnology industry has. And the importance of it, while it's still small, is that it's growing quite a bit, and that's an important thing to think about, that the opportunities for partnering with medical device companies are growing. So in 2012, a report showed that NIH funded for clinical research was about $31 billion, which over the course of the previous almost 20 years was only about a 1.7 increase, which was slightly less, I think, than inflation. So NIH was not keeping up in terms of funding clinical research. The pharmaceutical and biotech companies were funding about $56 billion, so more than NIH, and slightly ahead of the inflation rate, so continuing to be major players in funding clinical research. Medical device industry in 2012 was only about $12 billion only. That's still a lot of money. It funds a lot of trials and opportunities for innovation in medical device testing. But it was a threefold increase over that same almost 20-year period, which suggests that some things have changed. One of them being that the acceptance of technology, medical technology in clinical medicine is growing. So a lot more opportunities for new devices to be put into clinical practice, and so a lot more opportunities for testing. The FDA has continued to find better and faster routes and safer routes for testing devices and getting them into studies, as I mentioned, early feasibility trials, investigative new device trials. And in addition, there are just more innovations and venture capital being poured into medical devices, so therefore there's more funding to be had. So how do we tackle the issues around the conflict of interest? If there's this sort of benefit to increasing innovation and speeding translation and better clinical care, potentially lower costs, how do we sort of mitigate the conflicts of interest that besiege those partnerships? Some have argued that, I put the word eliminating up there as well, because some have argued that really what the approach needs to be is we have to eliminate all conflicts of interest. And I think it's pretty clear that that's not a feasible or wise approach to separate industry innovation and technology development and funding from clinical research. It limits the outcomes for patient care. And frankly, it just seems a backward step. However, the role of transparency and accountability, that seems to be the primary approach to overseeing and attempting to mitigate or manage conflicts of interest, still has some problems with it. One being that the focus has been primarily on transparency and less on accountability, certainly in official realms. Some would argue that while we're making it really clear what's happening in those partnerships, we're not necessarily always following up on the violations, although there have been some notable violations that have made it into the media. What is the accountability on both institutional sides, the companies and the healthcare centers? It's not always spelled out as clearly. But what both institutions have done is establish guidelines and regulations so that clinical researchers can have guidance to follow. So I want to look at both of those sides. Medical device company side, their conflict of interest related policies, and an academic healthcare industry relations policy, and also what the federal government's doing in terms of the open payments, Sunshine Act, physician payments, Sunshine Act that has gone into law recently. So we want to look at all three of those. First, medical device conflict of interest policies. Now, I'm going to draw from one particular medical device company from the Cook Group that I'm most familiar, but almost all pharmaceutical and medical device companies have put in place. These are required, in fact, if they're going to partner with academic medicine research, to have these in place. An ethics and compliance officer who's going to oversee the implementation, the construction and implementation of guidance, documents, and policy. Cook Group has a chief ethics and compliance officer and individuals at each company who oversee that, as well as a team at most of their companies that implement and train and track the activities of these partnerships particularly. So they have a code of conduct that the employees are trained on, as well as specific policy and guidance documents, one specific for the industry partnerships with academic and healthcare providers. So, but one of the things that's interesting in their code of conduct is this idea, and I think many companies follow this same path of what do you do when it's not clear what to do, when the rules and regulations aren't specific enough. And so they start off with an argument for doing the right thing. And what that means, they outline in a dozen or so approaches, statements. And I've listed about 6 of them here that had, I think, relevance to the conflict of interest concerns. And their number 1, do the right thing initiative and mandate is that patient safety always comes first. And so the engineers, the marketing personnel, the development people, everyone in the company is trained and is intended to understand that patient safety always comes first, which is an important component of conflict of interest concerns. following the policy and procedures that are outlined. So that assumes that these are effective policy guidances, and they've gotten, there's the medical device industry has a larger set of guidances that and best practices that are published so that the companies can follow these. But these are referring to the Cook Group policies and procedures that are in place for them. The idea of not even having an appearance of impropriety is a great guidance for, is one of their key guidances for those areas where it's not clear what the right thing to do is. And certainly consulting superiors is part of that particular initiative to getting insight from those who have more experience. Not buying business, practicing transparency, and respecting customers and following their policies. The Cook Group, as many medical device companies, recognize that some of their partners may have more strict or less strict policies, and that their rule is if the partners' policies are more strict, then those are to be followed. If the company's policies are more strict, then those are to be followed. The next slide's pretty intense here, but it's just, again, a section of the Code of Conduct, because I wanted to show, when I compare this with the next slide, which is the IU, School of Medicine's industry partnership policy, sort of the slightly different focus. One is a business in the sense of it's a for-profit medical device company, and the other a healthcare provider, both having some common goals for improving patient care, but their codes of conduct look slightly different when you compare them. So in the case of Cook Medical, their code of conduct, these are the components that I picked out of their code that really seem to connect with the conflict of interest. They don't have any that are specific, except for about the fourth one down there, which is follow the policy guidance on interaction with healthcare professionals. So within that, they have specifically designated some applicable laws, some policies that are aligned with the applicable laws of the state and the federal agencies, as well as the medical device industry standards, particularly around paying for meals, consulting arrangements, research grants, educational meetings, providing funding for educational meetings and business meetings, and they have bans on providing gifts and entertainment and recreation for their partners. But the other components are largely around business practices, except for maybe the last one, which is practicing transparency. This is now, as we'll see in a little bit, a federal requirement. They can't partner with research and academic health centers for clinical or translational research, clinical practice or translational research without disclosing any funding or transfer of value, and we'll talk about that. So we've got a company that's got a business approach, but with a clear emphasis on patient safety and quality products in a timely manner, and a policy and guidance for interacting with healthcare professionals. So on the other hand, the IU School of Medicine industry relations policy is a very specific code outlining a dozen or more specific areas where this industry relation have had problems. And so it's not simply about transparency, but it's also about some level of accountability and prescribed behavior, starting with foremost as disclosure. So this idea that any conflicts of interest, potential or perceived or real, have to be disclosed in all aspects of practice. This is done annually, it's done often, and it's monitored. So industry-funded speaking is prohibited, particularly at promotional sales or marketing events. Industry-funded education can happen when it's unrestricted educational grants, so to the institution or provided for a certain area of the institution. The funds, any funds for fellowships that are maybe specific to an area must be routed to the IU Foundation. So there's some guidelines here on how monies are handled and how the disclosure and transparency around those fundings can be handled. So putting a little distance between where the funding comes in and the people who are gaining it and making sure it's really clear is important, as you'll see in all of these particular policies. Attendance at industry-sponsored meetings is actively discouraged. That used to be a very important part of the partnerships, but as you'll see a little further down, if it has to do with scientific activities, there's slightly different rules there. But two areas which I think are interesting, the presence of pharmaceutical sales, particularly those representatives on campus, is prohibited, and yet presence of medical device representatives can be allowed under two circumstances, where the medical device representative is necessary for training on the device, its use, either implantation or explantation or ways of functioning or maintaining, and certain sorts of technical assistance in both in the clinical or in the research setting. So I think, although it's not specifically said, that would imply that medical device sales reps are not allowed unless that is their specific role. Obviously, there's been for a while now a prohibition on industry-sponsored gifts and meals in many academic healthcare centers, education centers, and the Sunshine Act was largely an federal oversight to make sure that that was being tracked and monitored, because it seems to be a prevalent aspect in which influence was engendered. So consulting for marketing or finance is prohibited. That's probably not surprising, but consulting for scientific activities is allowed. In fact, research consultation is encouraged. This is one of those areas where many understand the importance of this sort of partnership on exchanging important insights. Sometimes it's technology insights, sometimes it's clinical expertise, but that sort of consultation is encouraged. However, all the research activities need to be governed by a written contract, spelled out in detail and compensated at fair market values, which is to be equivalent to federal funding or state or other private source of funding. Pharmaceutics, therapeutic committees, there's been conflict and conflict of interest and influence demonstrated in how some of these committees have functioned. A number of studies in the literature have shown that membership is often, the majority of the membership have conflicts of interest with industry, either pharmaceutical or medical device, and that has influenced or appears to influence their voting. So in the IU policy here, voting membership is prohibited for those who have conflicts of interest, and the other aspect is the full disclosure of industry relationships is required for any changes to formulary. That has been one of the areas where problems of increasing use or shifting use of particular pharmaceuticals or medical devices has come under question, suspicion, because of those particular industry relationships. Ghostwriting, honorary authorship is prohibited. This idea that somebody from the company is hired to write your paper, even though you generated the data and you handed it off to them, or maybe the case study data was just collected in partnership and the industry folks write it and then you sign off as a key contributor, but it wasn't your writing. That's prohibited. Pharmaceutical samples is another area that has been under suspicion of influence, but in this case, different sorts of relationships are useful, but it's particularly not allowed for distribution of pharmaceutical samples in patient care. I did not find a particular statement about medical device samples, although there's just not very many medical devices that get handed out as samples.
You ever heard of that?
No, certainly they are.
Fascinating.
Yeah, certainly they are, but not as many as pharmaceuticals. So, catheters and wire guides and delivery systems can be handed out. So in this case, IU says, follow the rules of each facility where those relationships are already evaluated and they have rules in place. So there need to be rules in place for the facility, and that needs to be followed. And we could talk a little bit more also about this idea of having medical device reps in the surgical suite or in the areas where patient interactions happening. So the federal government has more recently gotten involved with this idea of transparency and disclosure, and the Physician Payments Sunshine Act was made into law in 2010, but really didn't get fully implemented until the Affordable Care Act in 2013. So we have a few years of data now, required disclosure. This act requires pharmaceutical, medical device, biological, and medical supply manufacturers to publicly report their payments and transfers of value. So it doesn't have to be just cash or some monetary, but value. We'll talk about in a little bit about what those could be, to physicians and teaching hospitals. So anything that they've contributed in that realm, clinical care or research, has to be disclosed. No, so it's the companies who are required to do this reporting. But it lists, as we'll see in just a minute, who it goes to and why. The report goes to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. It's publicly posted. The database is accessible for people to do some research, and I have a few slides we can look at if we want to about some patterns of what's happening. This is why this transparency at a national level is important to look at and to see if anything needs to be done in particular areas or not. The goal, obviously, is to increase transparency and therefore hopefully reduce undue influence and to help patients make better informed healthcare decisions and potentially to defer or deter inappropriate increases in healthcare costs that may not be in the best interest of better care, but better business and more money. Right. So this act, which is sometimes called the Sunshine Act or Open Payments, requires those manufacturers to report the names of the physicians and the academic centers where they've given their payments, the amounts of the payments, the nature and type of payment, and the date and the rationale or reason for those payments. So very specific documentation is required. The payments are annualized, so all payments for a given year must be reported, and it's reported at the time that the payment is made, not at the time of an expense, which can differ by months or even go into the next year. So that has to be tracked more accurately. So an important piece as researchers is you have 45 days once that's posted. I think it gets sent to CMS around, I don't remember the date, in March or April. There's 45 days for review and for challenge, and there can be corrections made. So it's important for those who are receiving payments or have been listed as receiving payments to have accurate records, so you can go back and make sure that the company has appropriately designated its support of your research or practice. And then the full annual data is published publicly on June 30th. So in addition to cash monetary payments, transfer of value also includes things like charitable contributions, consulting fees, fees for service, education, provision of education, honoraria, royalties, speaker fees, any gifts, any entertainment, any food or drink that's provided, any travel or lodging, all grants, all research activities that have any sort of exchange of value, equipment or materials or other activities that could be charged, and then including in clinical studies enrolling patients in trials. There are some exempt transfers of value that don't have to be reported, but it's sort of small number. Payments less than $10.21. That is actually every year. I don't know what the 2016 value is, but they're already beginning to ask questions about what 2017 is going to be, and it's not really clear to me why that's set at that number, but it was $10.17 in 2014, so it's gone up by 4 cents. But those payments do need to be recorded if the total annual value is more than $102. So in a sense, you can't get $5 payments, 1,000 of them in 1 year. If it totals more than $102, you have to report everything. So tracking that by the company is important, and tracking it yourself as a researcher or someone who's provided some value. There's also items that are provided at large scale, so conference giveaways where you can't really track who picks it up or who gets it, and the direct line of influence is probably not very clear. Those don't have to be reported as long as they're moderately priced items. Educational materials can be exempt if they're educational materials for patients, not any educational materials for physicians or trainees or other folks who are involved in particularly in patient care, or in this case research as well. In-kind items for charity care, product samples for demonstration and evaluation that are intended for patient use, not just for people to own, and short-term loans of equipment. So if it's in your lab or in your possession for less than 90 days, it doesn't need to be reported annually. So there's only a few places where those sorts of transfers of values do not come into play, and so it's important to realize that there's pretty close scrutiny now on this. And there's some very specific info that you can get frequently asked questions at both AMA website and the CMS website that are useful resources if you have questions about what did I get, what should I do, I have a question. Interesting, here's some data from 2014. As I said, there's been a number of publications that are tracking what's happening in this database, sometimes by specialty, sometimes just overall. But in 2014, there were 9.6 million payments to physicians, and I believe that includes all types, both research and clinical care sorts of related, totaling over $1.2 billion. It was 190, so this is money to individual physicians, I believe. And $192 was the median total annual payment, so it's a wide range. Again, these are median values, not the range from 57 to 725 is on the median, and interquartile I think it is, but the overall range was enormous. And interestingly for me is that the median individual payment is somewhere around $14. So pretty low number there that's being tracked as a potential for influence. Folks believe that there's potential influence all the way down to $10.21. So, you know, a large latte and a donut probably push you over that in terms of meals. But the range obviously from $11, because the cutoff is $10.21 up to, or in 2014 I think it was $10.14 or $10.17 rather. Up to about $22, again, interquartile range there. Interestingly, the percent of physicians receiving payments is about 56%, so over half of physicians are receiving some kind of payment, small or large. Primary care, in those areas, family medicine was the highest percentage and preventative medicine was the lowest in that range in this particular data that was analyzed 2016 in pediatrics. They were particularly looking at pediatric area, but they had some larger databases in specialties. Cardiology, which as well as orthopedics, high participation. Obviously, they're using primarily drugs and devices that are provided by and needed for their care or their research from pharmaceutical or medical device companies. a little bit more interesting data, and I'll go through this. I'm almost at the end of this, but I think it's just realizing that there's a lot of information. In 2014, 30% of active emergency physicians received non-research or non-royalty payments. So they're getting paid here, not because of technology or research, but a third of them are getting paid to do their clinical care. But again, this was less than $100, and most of it was for food or beverage. A lot of drug marketing there. In 2013, on the other side, orthopedic surgeons, 69, almost 70% were receiving payments. Their numbers differ very much because their value individually was quite higher. They had a small amount of the total payments, but a large amount of the value because they're getting more. Again, medical device companies dealing with surgeons providing much larger component of their funding and potentially more influence. So I think that's an important piece to think about, that small amounts over a long time might have influence, or large amounts in a short time might have influence. So some of the problems with the current policies that we looked at on both sides, folks have argued that the conflict of interest principles and policies go too far, and they stifle honest discourse and limit research productivity by forcing separation and isolation of researchers and on both sides. The idea that conflict of interest disclosures are potentially shaming, and the reporting can isolate researchers and, in fact, slow the advance of discovery has been argued. Also, the idea that the research climate has changed due to shifts in funding, and there's increasing examples of successful and sustainable partnerships with important research and medical outcomes. So we need to have maybe some more innovations around just the transparency and accountability approaches to conflict of interest. Some additional problems with conflict of interest policies, this idea that financial influence is the primary influence is really not comprehensive enough. It doesn't mitigate all potential ethical risk of conflicts of interest. Current conflict of interest strategies really limit the occasion for innovation and defining and developing evidence around best medical practices, as well as social and scientific benefits. And perhaps a clear indication of need for change is this: the relationships and partnership models are changing, and broader and more innovative kinds of partnerships between academic medicine and industry. So we really need to review and potentially challenge and have more effective conflicts of interest policies. So I think there's some few best practices that you might draw from this, and certainly if there's questions about conflict of interest around industry partnership and both with pharmaceutical or medical device or biotechnology, a consult with the T-Rex, which is on the next slide. But here's some ideas and thoughts about best practices and proposed solutions. Having integrity and scientific rigor in experimental design and data analysis is always essential on any research, and particularly when it's a partnership that has some potential for influence. Transparency and full disclosure and effective monitoring, peer reviewing of the research collaborations, both on the contracts of those as well as the processes and outcomes. Having increased validation of research findings really helps reduce the potential for lack of scientific objectivity or integrity. So having independent tests of the reproducibility of findings, those are often hard to do and hard to fund, but that's an important piece of ensuring good quality data and data reporting. Certainly external impartial review of research proposals, contracts, and the processes that research collaborations are using to monitor themselves and to have effective outcomes from their research collaborations. Providing effective training for everyone who's involved in the research collaboration is really essential. I noticed in both of the documents there's an emphasis on having training but documenting that everyone has had some level of training and understands the potential for influence and risk. And finally, institutional leadership and incentives for ethical partnerships is really key. So if you have questions, here's our consultation slide. You can go to find the form for a TREX consultation. The Translational Research Ethics Consultation Service is part of BSAP, or you can directly contact Dr. Schwartz.
Or Andrew Brightman.
Or Andrew Brightman, yes.
You're our expert.
Yes,
Outstanding. Outstanding.
Yeah, so I'm willing to take some questions.
I will ask you a question.
Okay, please.
So it looks to me like the bottom line of this, for a researcher looking at this, who has had the question you raised as your title, is it worth it? Can it work? Is yes, right? So you're sort of saying, go ahead, just do this the right way. I think your previous slide, can you actually back it up to that previous slide? I love that slide. It's like, follow these rules and go ahead. Are you saying that? Do you have any second thoughts saying that? Or?
It's not just me saying it. I think the documentation in the literature and the outcomes over the last, particularly the last 10 years, maybe we've really shifted from a model where there was enormous concern over conflict of interest and the tainting of data and the potential for harm, and really found that the opportunities are enormous for innovation and translation. So that's been documented, and I don't think people would argue with that, as well as the argument that there's still potential risk.
So the other thing I'd poke you with, and I kind of agree with you. First of all, I'd like to add something here. It's very interesting. The ethicists who talk about these issues, I was privy to a very interesting conversation where some ethicist, I can't remember who it was on one of these listservs I'm on, was reporting his disgust and horror that the director of his CTSI, not here in Indiana, it was a different CTSI, had said, we don't care about conflict of interest anymore. We just don't care about it. The future is collaboration. And this ethicist was going on about how horrible this is, and there's no more respect for conflict of interest. And I really thought, and it said in that context, that I think what the CTSI person was saying was, it's part of the world. Collaboration is here. It's not that we don't care about it. It's that we think we can manage it, and it's part of the future of research. And the CTSIs, these clinical translational research institutes supported by the federal government, are going to go forward, like you said, do it the right way, and go forward. Now, the other way of poking you and poking that CTSI head is, what about cognitive bias, right? So if you're in the tank, if your money comes from industry, either in a pharmaceutical study, I don't see the data on this, but maybe for a device study too, the chance of an encouraging outcome, an outcome that supports, industrial success seems higher in the studies that have been looked at. So you did all this good stuff, transparency and external review, but is there anything here that would worry us about cognitive bias, or not? Or do you feel like, I got another answer for you, I'll give you your answer. Part of me says, well, cognitive bias is always there, and so maybe we're too excited to think it's going to be somehow a dispositive factor in this case.
I think you're touching on something that's really critical, and I would even take the argument further, as some have done in the literature recently, that it's really not just individual research labs or a small or a particular collaboration, but the possibility that a larger scale cognitive bias within a research area could occur as these relationships become more pervasive. So in the idea that even as we're seeing multinational or multi-institutional collaborations around a particular area, research area in diabetes or in some other cancer or something, vaccine development or whatever, that there could be a mindset that's driven much more by industry desires for more resource management, financial gain, then that sort of clouds the whole area. So the ideas of, is more technology always better in treatment? And or do we really need to medicalize certain components of patients' conditions and treat them with a drug or a therapy, or are there preventative approaches that are much more effective? Well, there's maybe the sexiness of having fancy technology and advanced medications and drugs that would sway clinical researchers toward different outcomes. And if the whole group is sort of leaning that way, there's bias.
What I love about because I'm glad I asked the question, because that answer is beautiful. I think you're right. Of course, it does, though, get to these global questions about the nature of allopathic medical care. Right? My friends who are not doctors say to me, "You're Dr. Schwartz, you love Peter." They're my friends. I say, "Peter."
Mm-hmm.
They say, Peter, you love pills, you love statins, cholesterol-lowering medications. Don't you know those are dangerous? They're just furthering the interests of pharmaceutical companies. I say, no, I've seen this research. It's very good. These pills actually do reduce your risk of heart attacks in many people, and in a good way with very few side effects. No documented increased risk of Alzheimer's. And they say, yours in the tank. Like just you said, this cognitive bias towards pills
Mm-hmm.
and interventions to lower risk rather than being more focused on lifestyle or something. My friends, again, who do more lifestyle coaching things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I agree with you. It's really a deeper question. To blame pharmaceutical companies or other private industry as somehow driving this is wrong. It's not just them, it's the whole field. On the other hand, as you said, if they become more and more integral parts of the academic health center, and in fact, the academic health centers begin to depend, already do, depend on them for the funding, then mitigating or modulating the pill-happy, device, intervention-happy mindset of modern medicine will be even more difficult. Mm-hmm. So I guess for the individual researcher watching this, listening to this, the answer is be aware of your cognitive bias by getting involved, be aware of the dangers, be reflective on these issues, and do the right thing. I like that the device company says. Do the right thing and try. In fact, in your first case about the 80-year-old, he was 80, I think, who got the AAA device, I was thinking, gee, in that case, I'm less worried about the fact it's being paid for by a pharmaceutical company and more worried about the basic research ethics of that case. Mm-hmm. Does he know about the risks and benefits of this intervention? Was he offered alternatives? And so it's only ethical research if both of those things apply. He knew about the risks and benefits. He knew about the alternatives. He knew this was experimental versus an open repair, which is the standard of care. And I would worry about those details. Mm-hmm. And I worry that because it's industry sponsored, there's a danger that those things were not done right. But I must admit, I've seen plenty of NIH-funded studies where I've been concerned about the informed consent and understanding of the patients involved anyway.
Yes, right. Beautiful. That's good. Yeah, I agree. So, and I would just make one sort of addendum to what I said. It's not always about more technology or more medications versus no technology or no medications, but there's also, do we need a technology that's quite as complex or costly, right? Could we have technologies that are just as effective, but they don't cost as much and they're not quite so complex? They're not as maybe technologically as interesting and so there's a driver on our side as engineers to think, well, we just have to make it have more bells and whistles to make it better. So the important there is making sure that the clinical outcomes are measured equally.
In medicine, there's been a long tradition of pharmaceutical-funded work, which would be for new drugs. Mm-hmm. And that then the federal government got involved in funding comparative effectiveness research, compared newer, more expensive drugs to older ones, which had not been done in the trials of the newer drugs.
Right.
And those trials showed, in the case of ALLHAT, which is a hypertension trial, a high blood pressure trial, that the older, cheaper ones were actually just as good, even in some cases better, than new ones. Although, again, I will acknowledge there's some argument over the science of that study. Some research would say it was actually biased against the newer drugs, right? But that was an extremely expensive study.
Yeah.
Cost the federal government an extreme amount of money, and in the end had open questions about whether this really did settle anything about the newer versus older things. But of course, had to be done, and probably has to be done again regularly as new drugs come out and as new knowledge is known, which would not be funded probably by a pharmaceutical company. So in some sense, I also feel like the reliance of the industry on pharmaceutical or device research dollars is partly can be a reflection of an abdication of the public funding for research, and that is sort of turning the attention to this outside source of funding and saying, "Be careful," is almost a worry that's been people have been driven to it, and to then be said, "Well, watch out about it," is almost like a bait and switch.
Right. Absolutely.
What a great talk.
Let's
okay, I
end
hope
on
it's
that
been
point.
helpful to
Thank
people
you.
listening.
Yes.
Thank you, Professor Brightman, for an outstanding introduction and analysis